I tell this story in my own voice because for years other people told it for me, and they always got it wrong. They said I was angry, dangerous, a problem waiting to happen. They said I was a bully. I was the kid teachers watched from the corner of their eyes. The student security guards followed down the hall. The name whispered when something went missing or someone got hurt. I learned early that in a black body, silence could look like threat, and confidence could be mistaken for cruelty. I didn't grow up wanting to be feared. I grew up wanting to be left alone long enough to breathe. That's how this story begins, not with heroism, but with survival. I was 17, tall for my age, shoulders already broad from years of carrying things nobody else could see. My mother raised me to walk with my head high because she said the world would try to push it down. But at school, that same posture made me look defiant. If I spoke up, I was aggressive. If I stayed quiet, I was suspicious. There was no correct volume for a black boy's voice in those hallways. Teachers talked about me in meetings I was never invited to, and their conclusions followed me like a shadow. I knew because doors closed differently when I approached. Smiles stiffened. Hands hovered near radios. I didn't help my reputation, at least not on the surface. I wore my hoodie even when they told me not to. I listened more than I spoke. I had a stare that came from years of watching adults argue about bills and eviction notices. A stare that learned to measure danger before words. People called it intimidating. I called it awareness. When kids teased me, I didn't laugh it off. I'd just look at them until they looked away. That was enough for rumors to grow teeth. By junior year, bully fit me like a label slapped on a file, convenient and final. The truth was, I hated bullies. I hated the way they cornered people, the way fear bloomed in small spaces. I hated it because I recognized it. I had lived with it in different forms. Landlords who spoke slow to my mother like she was stupid. Police who asked where I was going, even when I wore a school ID. Teachers who praised my essays, but still seemed surprised I wrote them. Power enjoyed leaning on people who couldn't push back. I promised myself I would never be that kind of person. The day everything changed started like any other. The air was heavy, the kind that makes sounds travel farther. I remember the bell ringing, lockers slamming, the low music leaking from earbuds. I remember a teacher calling my name sharp enough to cut, telling me to remove my hood. I remember doing it slowly, meeting her eyes, and seeing that familiar calculation. Is he angry? Is he safe? Is he trouble? I wanted to tell her I was just tired. Instead, I nodded and walked on. I was on my way to the library when I heard the first sound that didn't belong. At first, it blended into the noise of school life, like a chair scraping or a door slamming too hard. Then it came again, sharper, hollow, followed by screams that bent the air. My body reacted before my mind did. Years of being alert kicked in. People froze, then scattered. Shoes squealed on tile. Someone fell. Someone cried for their mother. In moments like that, fear doesn't announce itself politely. It floods. I felt it in my chest, hot and electric. But underneath it was something steadier, something my mother had taught me without ever naming it. When chaos comes, you choose who you are. I saw two men at the far end of the hall, faces covered, weapons raised. Terrorists. The word landed heavy, unreal, like something from the news that had broken loose and found us. Students ran past me, eyes wide, seeing through me instead of at me. A security guard shouted orders that tangled with panic. Teachers herded kids into classrooms. I could have run. No one would have blamed me. In fact, if I had been caught later, hiding somewhere, people would have said it proved what they always believed about me: selfish, dangerous, thinking only of myself. But I didn't run. I don't say that to sound brave. I say it because in that moment, running felt like betraying something deeper than reputation. I knew the layout of that school better than most adults. I knew which doors stuck, which stairwells echoed, which classrooms had no windows. I knew because when you're watched all the time, you learn your environment like a second skin. Awareness they had called intimidation. Now it was clarity. I grabbed the nearest teacher, a woman who had once written me up for attitude, and told her to take her students through the science wing to the exits near the gym. She looked at me like she didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't wait for permission. I moved. I remember the weight of responsibility settling on me as I ran the opposite direction of safety. Every step felt loud, like it might draw attention. My heart pounded so hard it blurred the edges of my vision. I kept thinking about my mother, about how she told me to always come home alive. I kept thinking about the kids who had looked at me with fear just minutes before, and how fear had made us the same now. I ducked into a classroom where a handful of students were frozen, pressed against the wall. A girl I recognized from my math class was crying silently, hands over her mouth. A boy kept whispering prayers. They looked at me and flinched. Even now, even here. I dropped my voice low and steady. I told them to follow me when I said run. I told them to stay quiet. Authority doesn't always come from a badge or a title. Sometimes it comes from calm. They listened. We moved through a side corridor I knew was rarely used, past a storage room where I had once been accused of stealing supplies I never touched. The irony almost made me laugh. I cracked the door open just enough to check the hall. Clear. We moved again. I counted breaths. I counted steps. I learned later that people would call this leadership. In the moment, it felt like math. Risk plus timing equals survival. Shots echoed again, closer this time. The sound punched through me, but my feet kept moving. I guided the group to an exit and pushed the bar hard. Fresh air hit us like forgiveness. I told them to keep running until they reached the field. They hesitated, looking at me like they wanted me to come too. I shook my head. Someone had to keep going inside. I don't know where the courage came from. Maybe it was anger at being underestimated for so long. Maybe it was love for a place that had never loved me back but had still shaped me. Maybe it was simply that I knew how to move unseen, how to read danger, skills honed by a lifetime of being watched. Whatever it was, it carried me. I found a maintenance cart near the cafeteria and rolled it into the hall, tipping it over to block a line of sight. I pulled a fire extinguisher from the wall, the metal cold in my hands. I had seen videos, drills we all pretended to take seriously. I remembered the instructions about disorientation, about noise and smoke. Knowledge is a strange thing. It hides until you need it most. When I turned the corner and saw one of the attackers, time slowed. He was closer than I expected, scanning doors, methodical. I felt small and enormous at the same time. I pulled the pin and squeezed. White powder exploded into the air, filling the space with choking fog. He shouted, stumbled. I didn't think. I moved, slammed the extinguisher into his arm, then again. My ears rang. My hands shook. He went down, I didn't stay to see more. I ran, my lungs burned. I knew there was another attacker. I knew security would be coming. I knew that if police arrived and found me like this, a black teenager standing over a fallen man, the story could end very differently. That thought sliced through me sharper than fear. Heroism, I realized, is a luxury when justice is uneven. I dropped the extinguisher and raised my hands as I backed away. Even though no one was there yet. Habit, survival. I moved to another hall, shouting for people to get out, to follow me, to stay low. My voice cracked. I didn't care. When the police finally stormed in, the building filled with commands and boots and authority. I was shoved to the ground, zip-tied, before I could explain. Powder still clung to my clothes. My heart pounded with a new kind of terror. I tried to speak, but a knee pressed into my back. For a moment, I thought this was it. I thought about my mother again. They held me in a corner of the gym for what felt like hours, though later I learned it was minutes. I watched as students were escorted out, wrapped in blankets, reunited with parents. Some of them looked at me and recognized me. A few nodded. One girl mouthed, "Thank you." A police officer finally listened when a teacher insisted I was the one who had helped them escape. Another officer confirmed what security footage showed. The zip ties came off. I sat on the floor, shaking as the weight of what had happened settled in. News vans arrived. Sirens faded. Administrators whispered. Someone handed me water. No one quite knew what to say to me. I was no longer the problem student in their narrative, but they didn't yet have a new box to put me in. The days that followed were a blur of interviews and assemblies. People called me a hero. The same voices that once labeled me a bully now praised my bravery. It was dizzying. I stood on a stage while the principal spoke about courage and community, about how we should never judge a book by its cover. The words floated above me, well-meaning but light. I wondered if they would remember them. When the next kid like me walked those halls, my mother cried when she saw me speak on the news. She held my face like she needed to be sure I was real. Pride shone in her eyes, mixed with a grief she tried to hide. She knew how close the world had come to taking me one way or another. Students who had avoided me before now asked to sit with me at lunch. Teachers smiled more easily. Some apologized. Some didn't. I accepted the apologies I was offered, but I didn't forget the years before. Heroism didn't erase discrimination. It just interrupted it. I was invited to tell my story at community events, to stand as an example. I spoke honestly. I said I did what I did because I knew the school, because I paid attention, because I cared. I also said I had been misjudged long before that day. I talked about how being seen as a threat had trained me to be alert, how the very things used against me had become tools that saved lives. The room would go quiet when I said that. Discomfort is often the first step toward truth. There were nights I couldn't sleep, replaying sounds and smells the moment the knee pressed into my back. Trauma doesn't care about medals. I learned to sit with it, to ask for help, even when pride told me not to. Strength, I learned, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going with integrity. Time passed. The headlines faded. I graduated. I left that school with a diploma and a complicated love for the place that had both doubted and defined me. I carried letters from students I had helped, notes that said I made them feel safe, seen. I carried them like armor. I also carried questions. Would I have been believed if there were no cameras? Would my story have ended the same if I had arrived seconds later, or if the officer had made a different assumption? Justice, I understood now, is not just about outcomes. It's about processes, about whose word counts before proof arrives. I decided to study criminal justice, not because I trusted the system, but because I wanted to understand it, to push it toward dignity. I spoke to younger kids who reminded me of myself, tall and quiet and misunderstood. I told them their awareness was a gift, their silence not a flaw. I told them to survive, yes, but also to dream of a world that didn't require so much armor. People still sometimes flinch when they first meet me. Old habits die hard, but then they listen. They hear my story in my own words, not as a headline or a rumor. They hear the fear and the resolve, the pain and the pride. They hear a black life insisting on its full humanity. I am not a hero because heroes are allowed to be simple. I am complex, shaped by discrimination and love, by danger and choice. I did what needed to be done on the worst day of many people's lives. I did it while carrying the weight of being misjudged, and I survived the aftermath of being suddenly celebrated. Both required courage. If there is a lesson here, it is this: dignity is not granted by titles or turned on by tragedy. It is something we carry, even when the world refuses to see it. On that day, when everyone ran, I ran too toward responsibility, not to prove them wrong, but to stay true to myself. I still walk with my head high, not because I need to look strong, but because I know who I am. I am the kid they called a bully, the student they watched too closely, the black boy who learned early how to read danger. I am also the one who opened doors, who chose others over himself, who spoke calm into chaos. Both things are true, and together they tell a story worth hearing. When I close my eyes, I sometimes hear the bell again, the ordinary sound of a day that almost ended differently. I breathe. I remember the faces that made it out. I remember my mother's hands. And I tell this story again and again, so that maybe the next time someone like me walks into a room, they will be seen not as a threat, but as a human being full of possibility.